Well, it's already causing a bit of a row, perhaps unsurprisingly. The book that I'm talking about is Liz Truss's 10 Years to Save the West, Lessons from the Only Conservative in the Room. Well, the only Conservative in the room joins me now. Liz Truss, quite extraordinary, after 14 years of a Conservative government, and you were there for a decade and more, holding very senior cabinet positions. Is this by the end of the process that you were the only Conservative in the room? Or was that the case from the very beginning?
Well, the only Conservative in the room refers to the position of the UK in the global firmament. And what I faced was Emmanuel Macron in France, Olaf Scholz in Germany, Biden in the US, Trudeau in Canada. And the fact is that the free world has been largely run by the left, with the exception of the UK. I was the only Conservative in the room for many years, and it's not working. You know, the West is weak. We're seeing authoritarian regimes on the rise, and what we're also seeing is in our own societies, our very values being undermined. You know, the things we believe in, our nation, the family, individual freedom, all of those core values are being undermined, and that is what my book is about.
Do you, I mean, as we're in an election year, do you actually regard the current Conservative Party as being conservative?
Well, I'd like them to be more conservative. They're definitely more conservative than the Labour Party, which are desperate to kowtow to the global left, desperate to give in to the eco-extremists, desperate to have more immigration into Britain. But I would like to see the Conservative Party taking a stronger stance, and in particular, being prepared to change the system, because what I found as a minister and as Prime Minister, that too often, much of the power that was meant to lie in our hands actually lay with unelected bureaucrats, and it became impossible to get things done. So I want to see a Conservative Party that's actually prepared to challenge the status quo, prepared to challenge the system in order to deliver the Conservative policies that, you know, I want to see.
You see, you mentioned all those things about why Labour would be worse. Migration under a Conservative government running at record levels. You know, nearly 750,000 in just 1 year alone. Climate alarmism, it was Boris Johnson and Theresa May, in fact, that started putting us on to a net zero agenda, which is completely unattainable. Already the 2030 goal for no new petrol and diesel cars has slipped to 2035. And in terms of constitutional reform and change, a Conservative Party at its centre that fought Brexit, didn't want Brexit to happen, and then really struggled to deliver it. I mean, really the point I'm making is that do you really see at the centre and the leadership, not necessarily the members, you know, your members in your constituency in Norfolk, I'm sure, are still pretty conservative.
They're very, very conservative. Extremely conservative.
I even read in the book that a lot of them think Donald Trump's a good guy.
They do.
Yeah.
They do.
Which is unlike what we get in number 10 and number 11 Downing Street today. Do we actually right now have a big fundamental philosophical difference between the Conservative leadership and the Labour leadership?
I mean, you talked about things like net zero, you talked about immigration, but let's remember where those policies started. It was the Labour government under Blair that put in place the Climate Change Act.
Yep.
We're struggling to deal with illegal immigration because of the Human Rights Act, which brought the ECHR into UK law, but also the Constitutional Reform Act, which Blair put in 2005, which created the Supreme Court, which we never had before in Britain, which is now challenging government policy. So I would say what we have got wrong over the last 14 years is we didn't take on that Blair consensus. And now, when we're trying to deliver things like Rwanda, the problem is that we are hidebound by the Blairite legacy, which has essentially tied us up in knots. It's also meant that a lot of decisions that should be taken by ministers are effectively being taken by the courts. You know, they're being taken by unelected bureaucrats. So I would argue the problems started earlier on in 2010. They started when people said, Tony Blair is the master, I'm the heir to Blair. That was where the problems started. And now, 14 years later, we didn't do enough to turn that round. That's not to say, by the way, that, we've achieved nothing. We haven't. We have achieved Brexit as a major achievement.
Reluctantly.
But it's been done. We got out of the European Union. We've delivered huge amounts of trade deals. We've joined the CPTPP. We've delivered big education reform. The school results in England are a lot better now than the school results in Scotland under the SNP. So it's not to say we've had no achievements, but I think, and what my book says, is we should have done more to take on the Blair consensus. And that is at the heart of the problems we now face. And by the way, Keir Starmer just wants to double down on that stuff. He wants to outsource even more power. He wants to listen to international courts.
But the argument the other lot are worse isn't very powerful, is it?
Well, this is why I believe we need to acknowledge what the problems are and actually say how we're going to deal with them from a position of principle. From a position of principle.
Your own, and this is not an autobiography by any means. It's much more about the problems that we face in Britain and the Western world. But obviously there's a fair bit about your background, your lefty parents, your sort of C&D marches as a kid, a Liberal Democrat activist at university, and, you become a Conservative Member of Parliament, and now you finish up at the Heritage Foundation, giving speeches in Washington. It looks from the outside like you've been on a very big political journey, but do you think you have?
I think I have to some extent, and I think people say that Conservatives are libertarians who have daughters, and I've got 2 daughters, and that's definitely made me more conservative. But my parents are more left-wing than me. Yeah. And
quite a lot.
When I was growing up, I started to challenge their assumptions about the world. Their assumption that the USSR was effectively moral equivalent to the US and we should all give up our weapons. I realised from a fairly early age that maybe that wasn't the right thing, and I looked at what Thatcher and Reagan was doing and thought, yes, this is actually achieving a freer Europe. And I remember the euphoria of 1989, and so I've always believed in freedom. And I've always railed against what I would describe as the liberal establishment. So at the school, I went to comprehensive school in Leeds, and I was frustrated that we were being given lessons on anti-sexism and anti-racism rather than making sure that all the children in the class could actually read and write properly. And there was a sort of patronising attitude that emanated from some of the teachers, from just it was almost in the air in North Leeds, to be honest, and that sort of frustrated me. And I joined the Liberal Democrats actually because a Liberal Democrat candidate came to my school and gave a speech, and I thought, well, this is interesting. I'm interested in politics. I loved arguing. I spent all my time arguing, and I thought I'm going to join and sign up and see where this goes. And I never even considered being a Conservative. I didn't know any Conservatives. It was socially unacceptable to be a Conservative.
Even that?
Oh, yeah, completely socially unacceptable. So it was only when I went to Oxford University, I met Conservatives. I thought, these people don't have 2 heads. And I joined the Hayek Society. That was my gateway drug to the Conservative Party. So that is where I sort of, because the things I believed in, individual freedom, proud of being British, wanting our country to succeed, I gradually realised that the Conservative Party was a better representation.
I guess at the time, Paddy Ashdown was the Liberal Democrat leader, former Royal Marine, gave a very patriotic appearance. I mean, it was, wasn't it, the party of the youth? Yeah.
I mean, I joined the young Liberals, and it was,
through him, through Charlie Kennedy. I mean, and a lot of university students were voting for them.
But I left when Charlie Kennedy was leader.
Right.
And there were 2 things. One is his policy of putting up income tax for education. And the second thing...
A penny on tax.
A penny on tax. Yeah. And I just did not... Even before I started paying tax, even before I got into work, I just didn't approve of the idea that the answer to Britain's problems was making the government bigger. And the second thing was wanting to join the euro. I really questioned that. So those were the 2 reasons that...
So you've changed parties, your views have changed, but the basic philosophy, if Hayek was where you sort of got to, is that the state shouldn't be too big, basically.
Yeah.
And that we should be able to live our lives relatively freely.
I hate being told what to do.
Yeah, I know.
And I hate the government telling other people what to do. And having spent 10 years in the government, I can tell you it genuinely doesn't know best.
No, but government has got bigger and bigger and bigger during those 14 years of conservatism. Taxes have become higher. The controls on our lives have got worse. We've had none of the liberation and freedoms that could have come from Brexit. I mean, can you see why people are very disappointed?
Yes. Yes, I can. And, this is why I ran for leadership in 2022. Because people had voted for change in 2016. I recognise that. There was a feeling in the country that people weren't just voting to leave the European Union. They were frustrated about what was going on in London. They were irritated by the fact that the country was not reflecting their views. And they voted for change again in 2019. That's where we got a big majority under Boris. And I felt we weren't delivering that change. You
in fact voted Remain back in the 16 referendum.
I did.
But you're sort of a born-again leaver, as it was now. I mean, and I guess logically, once the big decision's made, you go with it and try to make it work. What has the whole Brexit process, now that we're out, what has it told us about ourselves as a country?
Well, the reason... So when I went into Parliament in 2010, I was absolutely passionate about the issues we just talked about, the fact the government was too big, the fact the economy wasn't dynamic enough. I think Britain can be a much more successful country than we are if we liberate people to succeed. And at the moment, the government is 45% of GDP. It is too cumbersome. The regulations are too high. So those are the kind of things I wanted to deal with. I was passionate about education reform. I became an education minister. And I guess Europe was one of those issues that I put in the too difficult pile. I certainly didn't want to join the euro or anything like that. I didn't want to see more integration, but I felt our biggest problems were at home and of our own doing. Our terrible planning system that means houses are sky high expensive, our education system that still wasn't doing enough to teach children the absolute basics of English and maths, which is your passport to success. These are the things I really cared about. And when the European referendum came along, I was, as I say, I was slightly on the fence because I just thought...
And you would need to resign, wouldn't you, to have campaigned to leave?
No, I wouldn't. If you remember, the cabinet were allowed to take whatever positions. They were allowed, David Cameron said... there was a big meeting where you could decide which side you were on. And I think what I basically said at that meeting was I felt that this would take up a huge amount of bandwidth. I felt there are other things that we should be focusing on. But I think since the referendum, and I was quite excited by the result, to be honest, because I like it.
Well, it was disruptive.
Exactly. I enjoyed the sort of popular sentiment of it and the fact that people were actually engaging in politics. Throughout the 2000s, the turnout was pathetically low in elections because people were frankly bored. They were frustrated that all politicians were the same. And finally, we had something that actually galvanised people.
On a big turnout.
And they'd gone out to vote. And the turnout, what I thought was one of the most exciting things about the referendum.
You talk about taking up bandwidth. It dominated everything, didn't it? I mean, Cameron resigns the next morning. We finish up with Theresa May, God knows how, as Prime Minister. There appears to be...
Well, I explain how in my book.
Yeah. Well, in fact, that part of the story is slightly bizarre. But we then go through parliamentary deadlock, where it isn't just the Speaker that doesn't want Brexit really to happen. It isn't just the Labour Party, or most of it. Actually, the Conservative Party just don't believe in it, do they?
I don't think that is true or fair. I think there is a divide in the Conservative Party between those people, and I'm very much one of them, who want to go for the Singapore on steroids approach. Given that we've decided to leave the European Union, the consequence of that is we need to become more dynamic, more nimble, more competitive. We need to get rid of all the EU laws straight away. We need to get on with doing trade deals with our allies.
We've made a decision.
We've made a decision, and that has huge consequences. So we've had a Whitehall that's been shaped by being in Europe. essentially supplicants to Europe. And it's almost like, what is that syndrome when you become a hostage and you start to love Stockholm Syndrome. Yeah. It's almost like that. Officials were constantly looking to Brussels for validation. And all of that needed to change.
But it was also, wasn't it treated really? Didn't the Conservative Party look at it and say this is a damage limitation exercise as opposed to a big opportunity?
Well, some people did. That is certainly true. So that is certainly true of the sort of Philip Hammonds of this world and the Treasury. And I was in there pretty much straight up, or quite close to after referendum. They absolutely saw it at that. And there were other people in the Conservative Party of that view. I'd call them the Conservative Party establishment, were of that view. But there were certainly others who wanted to embrace the opportunities in the Conservative Party. So the Conservative Party has been divided as to how to approach this issue. And I just thought, I'm a logical person. I thought the logic of Brexit is you have to do things differently. What is the point of leaving the European Union if you've still got all the laws on the statute books?
No, I agree with that. But in some ways, what this book shows also is that those divides within the Conservative Party don't exist just on Brexit. They exist on virtually everything. There are two distinctly different wings of the current Conservative Party. We're told it's a broad church, but it strikes me that right now it's a broad church without faith.
Well, I believe there is a clear Conservative faith and set of policies, and I've talked about what they are. Being proud of our nation state. Yeah. Low taxes and small government.
But that's your position.
But that is what I think the Conservative Party should and has been most successful when it represents that position.
But not for the last 14 years.
That's what I think the public want as well.
But the last 14 years, they've not done those things.
Well, we have not done enough to reverse the Blair legacy, which has created this,
Has anyone tried?
I've tried.
Well,
Believe me.
Well, we're going to come to that. Don't worry.
I've been at the coalface trying, and I think one of the things that my book is talking about is how, as I went through the system, because I was a believer in the system. When I got into government, I felt that as a minister I could change things, and over time, I realised that actually, in order to be able to really change things in the way Britain needs and wants, and that's what the public's desire is, there needs to be a serious change to the whole framework and structure of government. We simply aren't able to deliver those Conservative policies. So I know you might like to sort of criticise Conservative Party politicians. I get that. But there are an awful lot of people who hold power in Britain that aren't Conservative Party politicians. And actually challenging those people and those institutions is as important as making sure Conservatives are actually advocating Conservative views.
I understand that, and we're going to come to your Prime Ministership, the budget and the battles that you faced and the conclusions that you've drawn, which is really what this book is really about, because it doesn't just apply here, it applies across Europe, America, etc. But I just wonder, 2019, we finally get to 2019, the European elections see the Conservatives routed, May's gone, Boris is in, big promise to get Brexit done, 80-seat majority, the world at his feet. If ever there was a moment to take on some of those challenges, and I know the pandemic took up a lot of time, but it just strikes me that you had an 80-seat majority and did nothing with it.
I think it's fair to say that both after Brexit, after the 2019 election, and also after COVID, and that was another opportunity. There were opportunities to say to the country, we need to change things, and we didn't do that, and we should have done that. And why was that? Well, I'm pretty positive about Boris in the book, and I enjoyed working for him as in the jobs that I had, and I think he is a true Conservative. I think the issue was, and this is, he did not have the political infrastructure to deliver what ought to have been delivered after the 2019 election. And there were huge problems, which I refer to with, cabinet ministers who weren't on board with what he was trying to do, the number 10 operation not being up to it. And I fully admit I had the same issues with number 10 operation and the cabinet, which is why I say there is a problem with the way the whole thing works and is structured. It is very difficult in the current system to deliver those bold changes, which is what I think the country needs. Which is why I think we need a sort of a bigger rethink about it.
I think I'd rather disagree on Boris being a true Conservative. Metropolitan Liberal, it would seem to me, far more appropriate, totally unconcerned by mass immigration, fanatical about following net zero targets, doesn't seem very Conservative.
Well, I do disagree with him on net zero. And on immigration is too high.
Oh, right. Let's move on.
But he is prepared. On certain occasions, I did see in him a preparedness to take on the system and the orthodoxy, which is what we absolutely need.
Yeah, well, he did back Brexit, although when I listened to that...
He's not in Parliament anyway, so it's...
That first speech on Brexit, he wasn't that convincing. Liz, how government works is really, really important. You know, the public feel desperately frustrated. You've made the point already, and we'll go into it in depth, that actually your powers as a minister are very much more limited than perhaps the voters think. And, I mean, what a long list of jobs you do. Education, environment, justice, Treasury, Foreign Secretary. And I'm struck...
You've forgotten trade.
Trade. Oh, I'm so sorry. But that actually makes it even worse, doesn't it? How on earth can anybody have a mastery of those briefs if they're in senior government positions for such a short period of time? Isn't this part of what's going wrong?
It's part of it, but I think it's a symptom of the problem. It's not the cause of the problem. OK, all right. Well, we'll go into that more deeply. Education really interests me. You talk in the book about Monsieur Foucault, a French philosopher. You talk about him a couple of times in the book, and about this progressive... I had to study him at university, and it was hideous. And I thought, who is this nutter? When I studied him, and then I couldn't believe that when I got into government, that the ideas that he was promoting seemed to have been sort of absorbed into the ether. I thought that was incredible.
This is the progressive approach, the so-called progressive approach to education, the belittling of our history, the belittling of what we have always stood for. Almost, and you say in the book, it's almost as if through the education department and through schools, there's that element of self-loathing. Yeah, and it's the undermining of facts and the undermining of truth. And the undermining of objective reality. It's essentially anti-enlightenment. It's anti-Western civilization. It's saying, here we are in one of the most successful countries in the world that's had a huge positive influence on the rest of the world. And in the book, I also say that America is our greatest invention. Yeah, I enjoyed that. And it is. But not by design. No, by accident. But it is, we should be so proud of our country, and we should be talking to children about these ideas and how they were formed and what we've become as a result. But instead, no. So education, we see that's a complete takeover from the left. Environment, we've touched a couple of times already on environment and, this fanaticism with net zero policy, regardless of the cost to our manufacturing base, regardless of the cost to ordinary people. Justice, again, we've sort of touched on that already. So before, the highest court in Milan were the law lords within the Palace of Westminster, and Blair sets up a Supreme Court. Should we stick with the Supreme Court? No, we should abolish it. Should we? We should abolish it. And the other important change, and I didn't fully appreciate how dramatic this change had been until I became Lord Chancellor. But previously, the Lord Chancellor was appointed by the Prime Minister, sat in Cabinet, and was responsible for appointing senior judges. Yep. Now, who appoints the senior judges now? Well, there's a panel that does it, isn't there? It's a quango. Yeah. It's the Judicial Appointments Commission. Yeah, it's there. And what de facto happens is the judiciary have become a self-perpetuating oligarchy because the current Lord Chief Justice has a lot of say over who his or her successor is. Okay. So what we've done, or what Blair has done, is created a system
that has undermined the core of the British Constitution, which is parliamentary sovereignty. That is the core of the British Constitution, the idea that ultimately these bodies are democratically accountable. What is being created is another series of quangos making decisions which are gradually, I think, moving away from the views of the public.
So we go on to Treasury, and it seems the Treasury have enormous power over what chancellors say and do. It's all been linked in, very closely linked in, with an office for budget responsibility, who Labour incidentally want to give even more power. Is the Treasury as politicised as some would say?
It's groupthink. So they're not necessarily party political, they just all share the same worldview. That Britain's best days are behind us, that what we have to do is manage decline. We need more immigration to keep our economy afloat. We need to, because we're not going to grow very much, we therefore need to balance the budget by raising taxes. Regulations don't really harm business. The Treasury speak to all the big businesses. They say, we're absolutely fine with all these regulations. Meanwhile, a small business in Norfolk is struggling because all this extra stuff is coming on, IR35 is cracked down on, etc., etc. So they have a particular worldview, which is a worldview shared by senior corporate executives, people who work in the Bank of England, people who work at the Financial Times. So it's not a kind of conspiracy of, they don't even know they're political. That's the point. These people think what they believe is just common sense. And
is it because they all come from the same backgrounds? Or very similar backgrounds?
Yes, and they socialise together, and it's part of it's a liberal elite, essentially.
So you've spent a decade holding some of the biggest jobs in the country. You've confronted with each of these jobs. Maybe
I shouldn't have told them what I thought of them. I think this is part of my problem,
Did
to be honest.
Did you at the time?
Yes, I always challenged the officials, and I said, I don't agree with this economic modelling. So the way that they model infrastructure projects, roads, is they say how much time it will save you to drive, and that's the value. And of course, that makes it much more viable to build a project in London, where there are already lots of people travelling and lots of roads, than it does in a rural area or in a town in the north of England. So the whole way they think sort of perpetuates our current economic model. And I challenged all of those things.
What's their thinking?
I think I was quite a difficult minister.
No, well, it sounds like you were. And what's their thinking behind HS2? Which we seem to be sort of...
Well, actually, the Treasury, funnily enough, were against HS2.
Oh, were they?
They were actually against HS2. That was a pet project of Andrew Adonis that just never died. But they're generally against projects that don't have very high returns, that generally aren't in.
And they're generally London-centric in their thinking, is the point you're making.
Yes, or big city-centric. Big city-centric.
So you've done all these jobs. You've run into these obstacles. You've seen the extent to which power has been transferred to the judiciary, to the quangocracy, or is it the deep state? You called it the deep state recently when everyone went mad, but you meant the quangocracy, didn't you?
I did. I meant. So there's two elements. There's a quangocracy, but there's also the civil service itself.
Yeah.
And we are still operating under the sort of Northcote Trevelyan civil service, the idea of impartiality. Yet, Sue Gray, senior civil servant, is now Chief of Staff for the Labour Party.
Yep.
We've had a whole bunch of Foreign Office civil servants last week saying ministers have too much power. There should be more power for the Foreign Office bureaucracy. You had another former Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office, Simon MacDonald, saying he was upset about Brexit and telling Foreign Office civil servants that. So I think this idea of a civil service which doesn't have a worldview is past its sell-by date.
Yeah.
And this is an issue we really have to address if we want to deliver real change and conservative change in the country.
And
I can't tell you how difficult it is
to
run an organisation where people fundamentally don't agree with what you're trying to do.
Was this the same Sue Gray that you were pictured hugging at one point?
Well, she hugged me.
Okay, right, there we are.
It was an unrequested hug.
There is the Liz Truss defence on that. What I'm getting to, Liz, is, you'd seen, as a senior minister, across a broad range of government, you'd seen how difficult and bad the obstacles were. Yet, when the moment came, you decided you would put your name forward to run, to get the top job, to be Prime Minister. Did you, at that moment, had you decided, right, well, I know what you said to the members, and there were very big differences between you and Rishi on China and many, many other issues. And actually, in many ways, it was just the Conservative members that voted, but in many ways, it was actually quite a good contest, because there were some real debates that took place and some real differences that emerged between the two of you. When you went into that, did you say, right, I am going to be the most radical Prime Minister we've had for 3 or 4 decades?
I wanted to change things.
Yeah.
That's why I'd spent years as a government minister fighting all my own battles, on education, on the environment, on trade deals, getting those through. And I thought, you have to accept a certain amount as a cabinet minister. You can't just challenge every other policy that everybody else is pursuing all the time. But I was frustrated that we were putting up taxes, that we weren't doing enough to clamp down on welfare, that our policy on illegal immigration wasn't tough enough, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to change things and take that on. I wouldn't have said I wanted to be the most radical Prime Minister ever. I just wanted to change the direction.
Okay.
And the priority for me was Britain's stagnant economy and getting it growing. And I really believe that unless we got the economy growing within the next 2 years and showed that we had plans to do even better, then we'd be punished at the ballot box. Because I don't think voters vote on whatever press release comes out of number 10.
No.
I think they vote on, how do I feel about my life? What am I actually getting in each week? What are my bills? That's what people vote on. And I could tell that they weren't happy and things weren't going in the right direction.
So that was the plan. Look, you win the contest.
That was the plan.
you win the contest reasonably comfortably, quite a big margin, over Rishi Sunak. And then this completely astonishing and historic turn of events, which you document, that the Queen is up at Balmoral and Boris Johnson goes to Balmoral to say goodbye. You turn up at Balmoral, you meet the Queen, and it is, I believe, the last ever photograph of the Queen, and that was on the 6th of September. I remember seeing the photograph, thinking that she did look very, very weak. Very, very weak indeed. But I still, 2 days later, simply couldn't believe when we heard the news that she'd gone. It seemed that she'd never, ever go. She gave you some advice, didn't she?
She did give me some advice.
What did she say?
She told me to pace myself.
Very sensible advice. Did you listen to her?
Maybe not enough.
I think many would say she was very... Maybe she said... Because she was very, very knowledgeable politically, far more, I think, than most of the British public understood. Perhaps she could see that you were in a hurry.
Perhaps she could. Perhaps she could. She was very... she was incredibly lucid at that meeting, incredibly across what was happening in Britain. She was a great person. Yeah. And, it was a very sad loss, for the nation, but also, frankly, for me personally. And she finished our meeting by saying, I'll see you again next week. Yeah. And I thought, she would be there, and she wasn't.
And there we are. 2 days later, it's the 8th of September 2022, and the official announcement comes late in the afternoon that the Queen's gone. And you've got this situation where Charles, he's waited forever for this job, but his mother's just died. That can't be very easy at all. And you've literally been Prime Minister for a few hours. And the most famous person in the world, and the head of the Commonwealth and the Queen of our country has gone. You do sort of almost admit in the book that it was a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, it was. It was. And by that stage, I was just in, performance and survival mode. So, the leadership election had kicked off while I was in Indonesia. I watched Boris resign from a hotel screen in Bali, of all places. And I had to sort of rush back. And then from then on, it was just, it was building the car as we were driving along on the road, on the leadership contest, filming videos, doing events, doing announcements, getting ready when it looked like I was going to win, getting ready for government, doing all that preparation, and then straight in with all the things like appointing the cabinet, making the speeches. So in that circumstance, there was a moment which was a few days after the Queen had died, and I was sitting on the sofa with my daughter. I just burst into tears because it was all so overwhelming.
I'm sure it was. Yes, you had all those things to do, and yet this story, the Queen's death, the lying in state, the extraordinary funeral, which was unbelievable. The crowds that gathered in Hyde Park and at Windsor, it was quite astonishing. And that photograph, as I say, of you with her, the last photograph ever recorded of the Queen. Things move incredibly quickly, Liz, don't they? Because, we're 6th of September, we're 8th of September.
I can't believe, when I look back, I just can't believe it all happened so quickly and so much was fitted into every 24 hours.
Because suddenly it's budget. And we're still actually not out of the third week of September. It's the 23rd of September. It's the budget being delivered by Kwasi Kwarteng. And I've got to tell you, as somebody that believes in small state and free enterprise, it was the first budget I'd listened to since, I think, Nigel Lawson, when I was in a city trading room. And I thought, wow, this really is going to sort of cause a huge debate and some real change. I must admit, I had mild caution that maybe on the tax cuts it was too much too soon. But it seemed to me this was a genuine attempt to turn things around and stimulate growth. It's difficult, obviously, given where you went with it all. I guess the biggest failure of the lot, if I look at it and get your point of view, but you were open to the charge of unfunded tax cuts without any corresponding cuts in government spending. Are they fair criticisms? Because that's what everybody thought and saw.
Well, this idea of an unfunded tax cut is a left-wing idea. Nobody ever talks about unfunded spending. We'd had several furlough announcements, which were much bigger than what we announced in the mini-budget, which had gone unnoticed. They'd gone unmonitored by the Office of Budget Responsibility. And this is what I mean about the ideological bent of these institutions and organisations. And the biggest change in the mini-budget was not raising corporation tax. So it wasn't actually a tax cut.
No.
It was cancelling a tax rise. And I thought it was madness putting up corporation tax just as the country was emerging from COVID and we were trying to attract businesses and enterprise into our country. And, the other things like the VAT on duty-free shopping, a lot of these things have been proven over the last 2 years not to have raised the revenue that was expected. So this point about unfunded tax cuts, I don't accept. But I did want to make one other point, Nigel, which is what we were also planning to do is hold down public spending. And I was clear about that. I was clear we weren't going to cut public spending, but we were going to hold it down.
Do you think
on welfare,
if you said you were going to cut public spending, do you think you might have got away with it?
If I had said, and by the way, what's happened since is public spending's been increased. So if you compare my plans to what's actually happened, we would have spent less under my plans just by holding public spending constant, by only putting up welfare by wages and not prices. That would have saved £7 billion a year. So the things are, and even my plan to put welfare up by wages, not prices, which I think is fair enough. I don't see why people on working age benefits should be getting more than somebody in a job. Even that caused consternation amongst Conservative MPs. So if you think If you think, Nigel, I couldn't even get just putting welfare up by wages, not prices, through Parliament, how do you think spending cuts would have gone down? It just wasn't politically doable. And what I know, and I've been Chief Secretary for 2 years in charge of government spending, is the important things that we should be cutting, such as getting rid of a lot of these quangos, it takes several years to come through. Because the first year you're paying things like redundancy payments. Good public spending cuts actually take quite a long time. Because if you do short-termist cuts, and frankly we saw a lot of that early on in the Conservative government, they come back to bite you later because you're just not doing the activity. You've got to actually show how you're going to reform public spending. So what we were planning to do, and we were made this very clear, is we were planning to do a spending review later in the year to look at those longer-term things. We were very clear we would hit our debt target. We said that to the markets. But the problem was we had organisations, including the Treasury, including the OBR, including the Bank of England, that basically didn't support the policy. So, of course, they were briefing out stuff about...
Well, it wasn't just them. The International Monetary Fund in Washington was very critical of the budget. I mean, there was this feeling...
You've got to... What was the IMF's criticism? The IMF's criticism wasn't that it was economically bad. Their criticism was it was unfair.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what business is it of theirs, whether or not
and
British tax... That's a domestic policy. I can't believe you're quoting them, to be honest.
No. Listen, I'm not saying I agreed with them, but it was, as an observer, I could see that the opposition...
There was a pile-on,
was
not just from the left in Britain, and by the left I include quite a lot of the financial media, but also from the US... from others, because they don't want their economic model to be challenged.
Yeah.
And unfortunately...
And your own backbenchers, a lot of them were very wobbly.
Well, that's true. And some of them actively opposed the policies. Yeah. And I kind of thought about this when I ran for leadership. I thought, am I going to actually be able to deliver these policies? Is there enough support for them? And I thought we had to... What was the alternative? The alternative was doing nothing and not getting the economic growth and the economic opportunities that were so important for putting the country on the right track. So I was conscious of that. I did hope that my colleagues would give me a chance and support me in the first instance, and frankly, there wasn't enough of that.
No.
But
that's politics. But the part of this book that I think is the most interesting, and, you're going to be called a conspiracy theorist and many other things, but it is the role of the Bank of England, not just after the budget, but before the budget. Did the bank know what was coming in the budget?
Yes.
They did?
Of course they did.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I spent the whole summer in the leadership contest talking about all the major measures and saying there would be an urgent fiscal event to announce these measures. So the corporation tax cut, which was not rising, that was the thing I talked about.
That was well documented.
And that was the thing that I was forced to reverse. Yeah. That is the thing that I was forced to reverse, essentially by the economic establishment. And of course they knew about it. And the Bank of England in regular touch with Treasury officials, we had worked up the entire mini budget with Treasury officials prior to me getting into number 10. So they all knew about it. The Bank of England was cited on it.
And yet, ahead of the budget, interest rates need to rise to curb inflation. They don't rise as much as everybody expects them to do. That makes sterling a little bit weaker on the exchanges. And then this extraordinary measure where the Bank of England sell British government bonds, better known as gilts. Did they try to, do you believe in your own mind, that the bank tried and helped to engineer a run on the markets?
What I think, and is for the Bank of England to answer what happened over those days, is they certainly didn't work to support the government's fiscal policy with their monetary policy. And we know that that is the successful way to approach economic policy, is that fiscal and monetary policy have to work together. and they certainly didn't work to support that, and nor did they alert Kwasi or I to the real risks in the market of the LDI issue.
I've worked in financial markets. I've been around financial markets for 40 years. I'd never heard of LDIs.
Neither had I.
I'd never heard of LDIs. Tell us what LDIs are and why they mattered.
So LDIs are liability-driven investments. Now, I've only found out about this after the market crisis kicked off. And what has happened is because of pensions regulations in the UK pension funds were trying to find a new vehicle to invest in that would bring higher returns. So it's almost a bit like what happened ahead of 2008 in terms of the financial markets. The problem with these liability-driven investments is they were very susceptible to changes in the interest rates and changes in bond prices. And essentially, Britain was very exposed to them. So we had 60% of the world's LDIs were held in the United Kingdom, including by the Bank of England's own pension fund and organisations like BlackRock. And these were worth trillions.
Yeah.
So what actually happened after the mini-budget, it really came to light on the Monday morning after the mini-budget, was these pension funds then had to make cash calls. And they could have potentially, become illiquid. That was the issue, and that's what drove the market panic.
Yeah. And then you're on the back foot, and you have to...
And we didn't know anything about it. I mean, this is the trouble, that if somebody said to you, what's going on here? Because, of course, we knew that interest rates would have to go up. They'd been too low for too long. And that was going to be a consequence of what was happening globally. The Fed had put their interest rates up. The Bank of England hadn't put interest rates much to say. But what caused the difficulty in the run was the unique exposure to these products.
And actually a regulatory failure, because what the regulator here was doing was forcing pension funds to put huge amounts of their money into government bonds, into gilts, rather than making their own choices. Of itself, the LDI story is an enormous story. Liz, you finish up very much on the back foot, embattled. You have to, U-turn on one of the key flagship policies. Kwasi goes. Those last few days must have been very, very difficult indeed.
I mean, so immediately after the whole LDI issue becomes apparent, this is when the governor of the Bank of England intervenes. But he intervenes to create only for a certain period of time, 17 days. So what that effectively does is create a cliff edge, which means rather than sorting out the problem, it's creating speculation about what the government did. And at that time, there was also a lot of briefing coming out of the Bank of England, essentially blaming the mini-budget for what was actually happening in the LDI market. And so not only had we not been alerted to this LDI issue, we were actually being blamed for the consequences. So there was blame shifting going on from the Bank of England and the authorities onto the government over an issue we had no control over, no sight over. And we were not prepared to respond to that. I mean, when I got into number 10, we'd had a fairly new team recruited. People weren't necessarily experienced in these issues. And what happened is the economic establishment did use that to be able to lay the blame at our door.
Well, they got their way. And in the end, you had to resign. And the whole thing on a personal level must have been horrific.
Well, it was in those types of circumstances, my absolute focus was making sure that, we didn't end up in some kind of guilt crisis. I didn't want to let the country down. So even though I was very angry with the Bank of England about what they'd done and the way that they were behaving, even though I was very angry with the Office of Budget Responsibility, who had essentially leaked the fact that there was a £70 billion hole in the budget. That leak turned out not to be true, but that spooked the markets as well. So I had active leaking and briefing going on, if I had responded and said that, if I'd responded and criticised the Governor of the Bank of England or gone on the record and criticised the OBR, I feared that would create more difficulties in the markets. And what I didn't want was to be in a situation where Britain was not able to fund its debt. So I had to take it, basically. And that was beyond frustrating because I still believe, and many economists agree with me, from Art Laffer to Patrick Minford to Doug McWilliams, I still believe my plans were the right plans. But I just faced huge hostility in seeking to implement them.
You could have packed your bags and gone away and disappeared, but you're running again at the next election. You're busy, you've been out, you've formed Popcorn, you've been in America, you have got this book, you're worried about the West as a whole, that the problems that we face here are very similar problems to North America, to Europe. There are two big events this year that might have an effect on all of these. One is the British general election, but kind of when Sir John Curtis, the doyen of political commentators, says it's 99% certain that Keir Starmer will be in number 10, I guess there isn't much to say other than, you want a new Conservative Party. You want a Conservative Party that believes in the things that you believe in. How likely do you believe that is?
Well, I want to get the Conservative Party to adopt the right policies and the right approach as soon as possible. I want us to do it before the election. So I want us to say these things in the manifesto. So I will keep fighting for those Conservative ideas. And I think one of the big divides in the Conservative Party at the moment is between those of us who think we need serious change to our institutions that have become wokeified, that have become obsessed with, net zero or politically correct ideas, or big government as well, which is another threat. I think there are those of us who believe those institutions have changed, and there are those who want to continue with the status quo. And that is the battle within the Conservative Party. And I believe that we, the popular Conservative side of that argument, need to win that in order to be able to turn the country around. I mean, that is...
It's going to be very
We're not going to be able to turn the country around without serious change. That's my conclusion from the time I spent in government, that
well, you're
maybe
right,
there are plenty of things I could have done differently, and, I could have...
Of course.
But fundamentally, the plans I put forward were not extraordinary plans. Those were plans designed to get the British economy back on the right track, and they faced the most monumental resistance. And I'm still being trashed to this day for the mini-budget, even though the vast majority of work wasn't actually implemented. So I think it just shows the huge resistance to those types of ideas, and frankly, how hard we're going to fight, or have to fight, to make them happen.
Well, to quote Eric Morecambe, I think you were playing all the right notes.
I think that's a Boris Johnson quote. And,
is it really?
And it is a Boris. I think he said that about me.
I've been saying
you're peas of the same pod. But it's frankly easy for people who haven't been in government to say, you should do it like this, or you should do it in this order. I was trying to work through the institutional obstacles which I knew existed. Otherwise, we wouldn't have even been able to do the mini-budget in the first place. It's pretty tough when you've got an environment that doesn't support what you're trying to do.
I know. Well, that was the big difference, wasn't it? That in the 80s, when we had a radical Conservative Prime Minister, actually, apart from a few on the backbenches, there was strong parliamentary support.
And also, there'd been many years of preparation.
Yeah.
There'd been many years of intellectual preparation and many years of political preparation. It was time that we simply didn't have. So, and what I felt, and I still believe this now, that if we hadn't acted quickly, nothing would have happened. The only chance we had was to go in there and try and change things quickly.
Well, you did.
I can tell you that the waters would have closed over us if that hadn't been the case. And that is my firm view, knowing what I know about the way these institutions work.
Well, we'll see what the future of conservatism is. I sense that reform will be part of that whole post-election debate. But final thought, if Donald Trump wins on November the 5th in America, can he save the West?
Yes.
Wow.
I think he's an important part of saving the West. And I think that if Joe Biden gets into office again, it will be disastrous. It'll be disastrous from the point of view of our enemies and the fact that they're already making progress, China, Iran and Russia, but also the fabric of American society, because these issues that we're facing in Britain, extreme gender ideology, children being able to mutilate themselves essentially, the issues we're facing with an extreme net zero agenda. Haven't even talked about my favourite subject of fracking yet on this programme, but also the issues with illegal immigration. If that is allowed to continue in the United States, they are ultimately the lodestar of the free world. I think we have to acknowledge that, even though they're our greatest invention, we have to acknowledge that probably we're not carrying the baton at the moment.
We'll finish on that point of strong agreement. Liz Truss, thank you. And here it is, Liz Truss's 10 years to save the West.